Hello, as we watch where everybody's joining from, which is fascinating and exciting, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar, Will There Be Nonprofits in 30 Years? I'm Leslie Slavitt. I'm privileged to be the Executive Director of the Johnson Center, and I encourage everybody to continue to drop notes in the chat. It's fascinating to see as everybody continues to join us. We're going to have a few notes on housekeeping before we get into the webinar. And so the session is being recorded and it will be shared out with everybody within a week. There will be a Q&A session at the end, and I encourage everybody to start putting notes in the Q&A. If you have a question, you have an idea and a thought, don't lose it. Put it into the Q&A box now. In addition, if you have any issues or any technical problems throughout the webinar, please put the note in a chat. We have people who are personing that and will respond and take care of that. In addition, after the webinar, we will send out a survey and really hope everybody will respond to it. That helps us make sure our programs meet your needs and are engaging content topics. And a little bit of background here before we begin. And so 3 decades ago, philanthropy saw the need to build a direct route from the creation of knowledge to its application in communities. And what that really is the story of the people who turn ideas into reality. We stand on the shoulders of many at the Johnson Center, but particularly I would like to acknowledge our visionary founders, Dr. Russ Mobby, CEO of the Kellogg Foundation, and Don Lubbers, president of Grand Valley State University from 1969 to 2001, and a remarkable civic leader. I'd also like to note and thank personally and professionally the incomparable path breaker, Dottie Johnson, the founding president and CEO of Michigan's Council on Foundations, for whom this global center was renamed in 1999. And this series actually started on July 12th and concludes today with this topic, Will There Be Nonprofits in 30 Years? And this series is actually the culmination of our work reflecting on philanthropy over the past 30 years since the center's founding. Time does go very quickly, and it's critical that we take stock, learn lessons, and ask the questions that keep the sector vital and focused on mission and purpose. And I'm pleased that this series is able to contribute to that imperative. We've done a sort of a broad look across the sector the last 30 years. We went deep to look at sort of some present issues in an international context. And now we're projecting towards the future. What will things look like in 30 years? Each program has featured experts from the field examining the big picture of our collective work. I want to thank, in particular, 2 very dedicated and talented colleagues, Tori Martin and Pat Robertson, without whom we would not be here today and we would not be in the presence of such really interesting and fabulous panelists. These panelists reflect the wonderful sector leading ideas and thoughts of the panelists across this series, who have engaged in conversation with the nearly 900 registrants from 39 countries, and we can see some of that happening in the chat. I invite everybody to see parts 1 and 2 on our YouTube channel, and I think that's going to shortly be dropped into the chat. You can also go to johnsoncenter.org/events to look at our full fall calendar of professional development events for nonprofits and foundations. Also, I encourage everybody to go to johnsoncenter.org, the homepage, and sign up for email so you never miss an event, a report, or a resource from the center. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our 3 panelists today. We have Dr. Dana Brakeman-Reiser, Centennial Professor of Law from Brooklyn Law School, Heidi Hernandez-Gotti, Vice President of Client Services from Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, and Emily Rasmussen, founder and CEO of Grapevine. Thank you all for joining us today and for your thought-provoking words you'll share shortly. And the question, as we all know it, is will there be nonprofits in 30 years? And so I'm going to ask you actually to take a slight twist on that provocation and for each of you to respond to that question from where you sit in the sector and so to interpret it in terms of what it means for you. And with that, I'm privileged to turn the conversation over to Dana to begin the discussion today.
Thank you. First of all, just thank you so much for including me. It's such an exciting series of events, and I'm really thrilled to get to speak with people from all over the country and all over the world about this important question. So my take on this question of will there be nonprofits in 30 years is a pretty definitive yes. I think there will still be nonprofits, but I think they'll be joined by so many other kinds of entities that are engaged in social missions. And as a law professor, it's important to me that the law keeps up with that growing field in both regulating to make sure that the organizations that are ostensibly serving a social mission are doing so in ways that are comfortable in our democracy and fit well with the legitimacy needs that we have for social agenda setting organizations. And I also think it's important for the law to keep up in terms of making it possible to innovate and create new ways of doing good. And so I'll say just a little bit about both of those from my position as a law professor. A book I published just earlier this year talks about how players and practices and norms that are native to the for-profit sector have been migrating into philanthropy. And we rely on the 3 case studies mentioned on the slide: philanthropy, limited liability companies, commercially affiliated donor advised fund sponsors, and strategic corporate giving. And each of these is an example of how we see this migration from where money is being earned in the for-profit sector and the tools, techniques, and networks that are allowing that to happen being then deployed over in the philanthropic sector with a goal of social good. And that's a great thing to bring more assets and more energy to the table. However, these innovations from a legal perspective really circumvent the guardrails that are imposed by using the traditional vehicle for philanthropic activity in the US, the private foundation. We really assert the public's interest in targeting philanthropic activity, the public's interest in getting assets that are ostensibly dedicated to charitable purposes out into operating charities, and our interest in transparency of these elite institutions. We really assert all of those goals through the private foundation vehicle. And so as each of these techniques avoids using a private foundation, it avoids those regulatory goals. And my co-author, Stephen Dean, and I think it's really important to think about ways to reassert those. I'll say just a little bit more about 2 of the examples on the next slide. So a Philanthropy LLC, many of you may be most familiar with the Chan Zuckerberg initiative because, when you have a giant social media platform, it's easy to tell the world what you're doing if you'd like to. These are organizations that pursue a philanthropic agenda, but do so with a lot more tools available to them than a traditional private foundation. Of course, they can engage in grant making like a private foundation would. They have total flexibility to engage in impact investing. They also can engage in co-creation with founder or donor or leader organizations that they're for-profit entities that they've developed and often are huge and offer great synergies, and they also can engage in political advocacy. Of course, much of this is not available to a foundation, which mostly needs to target its distributions to public charities. In addition, they're not subject to the 5% payout rule, and they're not transparent. We don't know how many of these there are, although we certainly know a lot about CZI. There are many, many more examples that have, thrust themselves into the public sphere that we know about, but there's no required disclosures for LLCs, so we don't know about them, about their extent in our society. Donors obviously like this flexibility, they like the privacy, they like the control, and a lot of good planning can mitigate tax advantages from this strategy. But we don't have those regulatory imperatives being worked through when you avoid the foundation vehicle. Similarly, in the corporate side, strategic corporate giving happens when a large corporation typically is using philanthropy as part of its business. It's embedding philanthropy teams within broader corporate social responsibility teams and even line departments like HR, marketing, research and development. And at its most extreme, it can include dismantling corporate foundations, even in large corporations that had previously had them. Some examples are on the slide. This enjoys the same tax benefits as foundation giving, but avoids, again, that regulation in the foundation context. So those are some of the concerns I have with these for-profit philanthropy vehicles, that as the diversity of organizations pursuing social mission increases, we need to think about ways to inject those public goals into them. And then on the final slide, I talk about the other piece where I also see a great blossoming is in for-profit businesses that are blending their vision of success. They're pursuing profit both for their owners and social good. Lots of different models here that are discussed in a prior book that I also wrote with Professor Dean. Here, what I've noticed in some new work that is about to come out later this year is that when we see public incentives for these kinds of businesses, they tend to be linked to distribution constraints, to prohibitions or limitations on how much owners can benefit from enterprises like this. I think that's all about trust, convincing public authorities that these organizations are really trustworthy and really engaged in a social mission. If we want to allow these organizations to really scale to achieve the social missions that they have, for public incentives, and I would also argue sufficient private capital, we need to be able to ensure that trust at scale, and the law can be part of that. So I'll leave it there.
Dana, thank you very, very much. A couple of quick questions before we move to our next presenter. I'm interested, normally when people talk innovations, it feels good. You've innovated to solve something or address something in a new way. But I wonder from your perspective, is this truly an innovation, or is it something that's more sort of retroactive? Where's the push and the pull, do you think?
I think there is a lot of innovation in for-profit philanthropy. I think that most people don't go into philanthropy because they want to do harm, right? They want to do good. They want to see the change that they believe the world needs. But I think a lot of the folks who are deploying these techniques see the private foundation regime as unnecessarily constraining, right? They don't believe they can make the change in the world that they want to see without engaging with political systems. And private foundations are very much constrained from engaging in that kind of activity. They want to leverage the businesses that they've built and think that they can actually use those tools and networks effectively. But the self-dealing rules that apply to foundations are going to make it very difficult to do that in a foundation context. So I think there is innovation here in terms of there are new levers we can pull to, activate the kind of change that is desirable. But the problem is that leaves aside the regulatory tool that we have in our law currently, because these institutions, as much as I believe they are well intended, they are not democratically accountable. And the attempts at accountability that foundation law provides are lost when those tools are avoided.
Well, that's terrific. I have a number of other questions, but I'm going to save them as we come together for the panel together. So thank you very much. Incredibly thought-provoking. It's now my pleasure to turn things over to Heidi Hernandez-Gaddy. Thank you so much, Heidi, and now over to you.
Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you wherever you all may be in the world. I'm Heidi Hernandez-Gaddy. I'm currently the Vice President of Client Services for Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. And I've spent about the last 20 years of my career in infrastructure provision to the nonprofit sector. Primarily, my career has been around deploying infrastructure in service of grassroots groups to build power for vulnerable communities. And most recently at RPA, what we do is really look and take that work into a global context. I wanted to start a little bit by defining terms. Depending on where in the world you are, fiscal sponsorship may not be a common tool. And in the 20 years of my career, I've certainly seen this work blossom, and the understanding of what it means to be a fiscal sponsor has really grown and evolved. So at its heart, fiscal sponsors extend their charitable status to like-missioned organizations. That's incredibly important. The primary criteria is mission alignment. Fiscal sponsors focus on different geographies, issues, communities. We see very small fiscal sponsors. We see community foundations who act as fiscal sponsors as benefits to their own communities. So they can be very local, and they can also be very global. And as I mentioned, this field has grown in recognition quite extensively. It's important to note that we're really focused on a US-based charitable structure, and that this charitable structure has been increasingly scrutinized and increasingly regulated over time, meaning that it's become more and more expensive to be able to run a really well-managed, really compliant nonprofit organization. And it's really this lens that I want to talk a little bit more about, which is that when we ask our visionary leaders, when we ask people who are creative and who want to innovate and who want to solve problems, to cram themselves into these structures, they're often very frustrated. And as Dana mentioned earlier, we see the pace of social innovation, the rate of technological innovation, the rate of corporate innovation increasing. And our our charitable structures simply don't keep up with that rate of change. The last thing I think we want to do is to have our passionate, visionary leaders be bogged down and be defeated and deflated by being hampered by these structures in a way that sucks their creativity away from the focus on mission and social change. On the next slide, you'll see a couple of the reasons why people choose these partnerships. That burnout is very real. And the thing that I really want to spend a little time on with you is the fact that as a US-based charitable structure, more and more we see that our ideas around creating social change are really part and parcel to our notion of ourselves as a part of a global community. And the US charitable structure is important in the US and for Western philanthropy, but becomes really challenging to execute when we know that the problems, the intractable problems we are trying to solve, really require a global lens. And so what we'll often see is philanthropy particularly coming together to try to share infrastructure in order to execute more innovative philanthropic goals. If you're trying to solve issues around climate crisis, then you are going to want to solve issues that are global in nature, even while you're hopefully listening to those hyperlocal communities and addressing local community need in a very global context. The other thing that I'd like to say about these particular structures that I think is very interesting is that we are also, I think, trying to move towards more distributed leadership structures, and our corporate structures are often very hierarchical. So by definition, we're trying to co-lead, co-create. We're trying to diffuse the opportunities that we have to make community-based decisions, even when that community is global, to have a lot more consensus-based decision-making, to be able to seed power and push power into communities in a way that that the hierarchical corporate and nonprofit structures don't always easily support. And it's in this way that global intermediaries and fiscal sponsors can really be supportive tools for this next generation of leaders by taking over the burdens of those infrastructure challenges, by working with communities and understanding the communities that we are a part of. Then we're better able to either explain, create creative solutions, understand how to use regulations or how to interpret regulations maybe a little differently than they seem in black and white, and being able to utilize these structures in a way that serves communities and doesn't actually slow them down. So I'll pause there.
Thank you, Heidi, very much. I have, again, so many questions. But I'm interested, just particularly in the context of what Dana shared. Do you talked about the growth and some of the opportunities for maybe continued growth, I sort of heard at the end, if they could extend and expand and apply in a global context. Do you think that the solutions or the resolutions necessary to use these structures in that way will be something that happens? Will be those innovations that allow the structure to be applied in those ways, or what's your prediction?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's important to remember that intermediaries are nonprofits themselves. It's why the system works. And so until and unless philanthropy prizes infrastructure in and of itself, it's hard to see the continued growth and scale that would meet the actual need on the ground. So there's groups, a couple come to mind that are particularly focused on communities and community building, groups like Southern Vision Alliance, groups like Movement Strategy Center that are explicitly working with grassroots organizers, for example, that are explicitly on the ground with communities. Funders have to see those institutions as valuable in order for them to be able to grow and meet the needs of their communities. And that's true on a local scale, and that's true on a global scale. I think the evolution of philanthropic practice in the US is very specific to the fact that in the United States, our government doesn't provide a lot of the social services and a lot of the basic infrastructure that other countries are providing. So we're also often talking apples to oranges when we're talking about a global philanthropy. And so the understanding of of fiscal sponsorship in the US context has become quite evolved, and we're just starting to have that conversation with other Western philanthropies and other philanthropies around the world.
That's terrific. That's terrific insight. Thank you very much, Heidi. And now we're going to move to our final panelist. It's my pleasure to introduce Emily and to turn the conversation over to her.
Thank you so much, Leslie. Thank you for having me here. It's such a nice opportunity to be in this conversation and participating with Heidi and Dana and you, Leslie. So when this question was first posed to me, I guess I approached it from my perspective as a social enterprise founder. So like Dana was talking about before, social enterprise, that is what my organization, grapevine.org, is. We then went on to set up a fiscal sponsorship, like Heidi was just talking about, and then to start our own nonprofit. So my own personal journey has really kind of cut across all of these different structures in some way. So it's quite personal for me. But the work that we do at grapevine.org is we're a platform for giving circles. So we help people come together to connect, pool their donations, and collaborate to decide what to support as a collective. And often these groups are supporting smaller, more diverse organizations, fiscally sponsored projects, and looking to find alternative ways to fund smaller, more diverse types of impact-focused work. And so this comes up often in our work at Grapevine, questions about the nonprofit sector and alternative models to nonprofits. So anyway, so that's the kind of context for you all that to know that I came at this question with. And what it really surfaced for me initially is this broader question that I think a lot of us have been discussing within the nonprofit sector around whether or not there's even going to be funding and support for nonprofits in the future, assuming that there are people who will be wanting to start nonprofits and run nonprofits in 30 years. And so I'm sure many of you are very aware of these studies, and this research here is some of the research from Giving Tuesday, where they've done a look at broader generosity. And in this last study that they did, the 2022 trends in global generosity, they revealed some pretty startling statistics here about the decline in donations to nonprofits. And as you can see here, that's both a reduction in new donors to nonprofits, but also a decline in donor retention. And so this is really shaken, I think, the nonprofit sector and raised this question as to whether or not we will have donors to support nonprofits in 30 years. In fact, there are some people who say that these numbers show that in potentially less than 50 years, we will have no donors to support the nonprofit sector if we continue at this rate, right? And of course, that's a very, very big if. And so my belief, if we go to the next slide, is that actually, we will have nonprofits in the next 30 years, but there will be fewer of them, and I think fewer specifically of the smaller nonprofits. I do think that there is a lot of infrastructure built for those larger nonprofits that will be looking at these numbers, are looking at these numbers, already have great strategies in place to identify new donors, cultivate new donors. I think we have lots of technology solutions coming out, especially with AI helping to drive some of those solutions for nonprofits to be able to effectively fundraise and support their work. But I do think that the smaller nonprofits will continue to struggle, and many of them will find ways to continue. But I think many people who would start small nonprofits or would be running them in the future will opt for other models. And I think this is where I wanted to shine a light on this bright spot around generosity, because the other thing that we've seen in the studies from Giving Tuesday is that while donations to nonprofits as a sort of registered entity are down, generosity continues to be thriving, right? And what we're seeing is that people are giving to a much broader range of entities and projects and initiatives, some that were brought up earlier by Dana and Heidi. And so it's not just a matter of, a generosity crisis, but really it's just a matter of expanding how we think about generosity and what we find valuable to support. And so there's some, examples of that here, but the one that I want to, maybe what we'll do is just go to the next slide, because I've outlined a few broader categories here where we look at just the expanding funding models. And some of these, again, Dana brought up earlier: Philanthropy LLCs, strategic corporate giving, social enterprises, and more. Giving DAOs on the blockchain, that's something that actually the Johnson Center for Philanthropy published a post about that a couple of years ago that I was part of, and some other models here like the for-profit, nonprofit hybrids we're seeing with donor advised funds and more. So I think we are seeing this expanding type of funding models. And at the same time, we're seeing an expanding type of impact models, right? So beyond that traditional nonprofit 501c3, we're seeing crowdfunding, giving circles like those we support at Grapevine, lots of community and collaborative funds. This is a really big trend, I think, that a lot of us have been aware of, but haven't had as much clarity around. And actually, I think it was just last week, the Gates Foundation announced their new collaborative fund website, where they're really trying to shine a light more on this new model where people are coming together to collaborate and give to a broader diversity of entities. And so there are others here as well. We can get into a variety of these, but I just wanted to give you the high level here where I really do believe that generosity is thriving. I think that changing behaviors and preferences mean that generosity is going to a broader range of places. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I do recognize what Heidi and Dana were talking about around the slower pace of regulation and of some of our charitable models being able to keep up with some of these changing behaviors and preferences. So I think there's always a bit of a challenge in that transition period. But I do think, generally speaking, this is an exciting evolution of how we think about impact, how we think about being change makers in our community, and the models that are available to us. And like I said, I've had my own personal journey using a variety of models to try to fulfill the mission we have at Grapevine. So I'm happy to speak to that a little bit more specifically, but I think I'll pause there and turn it back to you, Leslie.
Thank you, Emily. And you really walked right into the question I've been wanting to ask you as you've been speaking, which is, one, you're sort of going a little bit against the trend you're predicting, right? And you've gone from a fiscal sponsor, something we just heard a little bit more about, to what is arguably the most traditional structure we have, especially if you look back on that last slide you have, into a traditional nonprofit. So if you could very briefly talk to us a little bit about why that change and the pluses and minuses in your experience of why you went from one to the other, I think that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we had a fiscal sponsor that was able to grow with us and support the model that we had in the way that we knew we needed, we would have been very happy to stay with that model. But we just outgrew our fiscal sponsor very quickly. And I think Heidi talked, very eloquently about this, how the alignment with mission with your fiscal sponsor is very important. And we certainly had that with ours. But there was just a scale issue and the ability to kind of keep up with the work that we were doing and the innovative work that we were doing in this space that wasn't quite there, and really strained their operations. And so we're very collaborative. They're actually a funder of ours now, and very much a collaborator with us in this next phase. But we did outgrow that model. And I think this does kind of speak to the other point I made, which is that I do think larger nonprofits will continue to exist, and kind of in this fiscal sponsorship role or intermediary role, like Heidi pointed out, right, that these are nonprofit entities as well. And I think what that means is that you're going to have lots of these smaller projects and initiatives under the broader umbrella of these larger nonprofits, which is kind of what we do at Grapevine. We have over 900 giving circles on our platform. Historically, before we were around, a lot of these giving circles would have to go and get a fiscal sponsor, right? And so, or start their own nonprofit. But now they don't have to do that because they're under our broader 501c3 umbrella. So in some ways, I'm against the grain of what I was suggesting where we were headed, but at the same time, I think we're also, directly aligned in that it's a larger nonprofit umbrella to support many smaller initiatives under that one entity.
Thank you very much, Emily. Now I'd like to invite Dana and Heidi to join us and to facilitate a little bit of a conversation between us. And to start, I think it's very interesting that we heard from Dana a little bit about being at the nexus of change, from Heidi about sort of the rate of change. And then I think you were really amazing, Emily, to talk about sort of an example of change, though it's interesting that what might have been your ideal maybe doesn't exist, which I think circles very nicely back to some of what Dana led us off with. And so the first question I want to ask, and I appreciate everybody's, raise your hand, dive in, ask one another questions. But do you think we're at some kind of a tipping point? We talk about Giving Tuesday, Giving USA. There's a lot of data that looks at trend analysis. Johnson Center puts out a lot of trend analysis work as well. Do you think we're at the point where we're going to start to see some meaningful moves in this sort of evolution of this moment where we're at? Is there enough activity happening that it's really going to start to have an effect on the number of private foundations, for instance? And maybe Dana, you wanna start there, but anybody's welcome to chime in.
So your last point about the numbers, I'm not sure how much immediate change we'll see in the numbers. I think it's really about, particularly, and I'm talking about elite donors, in that part of my work, it's about being selective, right? It's about using the vehicle that fits the way you want to make an impact. And when, elite donors, whether they're corporations or, high net worth individuals or families, when they have a variety of impacts that they want to make, they are going to look for the tool that enables them to make that impact the most efficiently that they can. And that often means with the least regulation. So from that perspective, I'm not sure if we'll see a change in the numbers. It may not be worth it to shut down your foundation, because it might be very useful to have it, for certain kinds of goals and achieving certain kinds of impacts, but you're going to broaden out and use other tools as well. I think that's what we'll see. I thought your question was going to be for me, kind of, is this a tipping point for the regulatory side? And I don't have a lot of confidence in that. I think this is going to be a place where the people in the sector, doing the innovation, really need to think about these public spirited goals, about, concerns about the potentially anti-democratic functions of a philanthropic sector, to really be aware of that and try to build transparency and other features that are going to kind of reassure the public of our ability to trust these kind of elite players. I think that's going to have to happen mostly on the private side, just because of our kind of broader impasse in the congressional and regulatory areas.
Absolutely. And as we think about what I'll call, sort of broadening the tent, or making the tent bigger so we can have more people included in it, we often talk about, philanthropy, adopting, for-profit models, for instance. Is there a way that we can incorporate them in that authentically reflect the sort of values and activities and ways of operating that philanthropy and nonprofits have particularly engaged in? Or are we going to sort of, is this a sense of wholesale sort of making us something we're not, or more like the other person? Do you know what I mean?
Is this for me again?
Who's ever smiling most, who'd ever like to take it. I saw something, I saw a glimmer in Emily. I saw something from you, Dana. Emily, do you have some thoughts?
Go for it.
I don't have a great response to that, Leslie, but I think my first thought in response to that was just like the desire to question whether or not that is something we want to bring over, and I think that's the first thing. I mean, the reason we have new innovative models and new approaches to things is because what we had before isn't necessarily working and filling all of our needs. And I think the philanthropic space has had a lot of its own issues. And so I don't have an answer to that question, but that's just where my first thought was, questioning, like, what are the things that are working well that we do want to bring over, and what are the things that maybe we don't? And it's an opportunity to reset.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of, a couple threads to pick out there. One, I think, Dana, you started to say it at the end, but really, I think the questions around regulation right now are way more political than they are about actual regulation or actual oversight, or communities actually being able to self-determine. They're much more political conversations right now. Who is using a C3 or a C4 structure to make change, to hide something, to not share, to share? And so I think the level of scrutiny has that political tarnish on it. And then I think, to what you were saying, Emily, like, purpose matters. And you can purposefully create a for-profit. And I think we're seeing more and more communities saying, we're going to create a purposeful social enterprise that's going to give back to ourselves differently than the nonprofit structure than we might have. And I think there's also some notion of, there can be, for many communities, an idea that the nonprofit structures are somewhat colonial. This idea that philanthropy is doing to or for instead of with and in service of. And we need to see that sea change happen also.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that, Heidi. And I would just say, from the work that we've done at Redefine, this has been one of the things that we've been pushed on the most, is why do we only move money to C3s? Because there are all of these and fiscally sponsored projects. We do those as well, but still of C3s. And there's been a lot of pushback on that, and people really upset with us about that, and us trying to figure out how do we navigate around that and get more money to purposeful, important programs, within the existing structure that we're constrained by.
It's harder than people want it to be, to just give money away.
Yeah. Oh, Leslie, I think you're on mute.
Is the both and here, right? And so we're sort of working on sort of multiple streams at once. How do we look at the problems we have and try to come up with solutions, in this case, as tools or vehicles that can best allow us to do this work? And how do we absorb and adapt existing models from other perspectives? That's a lot of sort of change taking place, to navigate at once. And what's your advice about how the field and stakeholders can best try to navigate that very sort of crowded but important space right now?
Ooh. Just the small questions today, huh, Leslie? I think donors need to interrogate some of those questions around empowering versus giving what you think is needed, versus asking if the thing you're trying to fund is actually providing the solution for the people who need it. I think as nonprofit professionals, we also have to continue to interrogate that notion of purpose, and whether or not the things that we're working on are actually furthering our missions in the way that we want to. And I think we all just have to do a lot better listening, which is probably a whole lesson for our country right now.
And it provokes something else for me, which is limited life foundations. And so foundations that take the approach of sort of retooling the way they operate with the notion of a termination. Maybe it's a sunrise in a different context, as somebody I know and respect says. But how do you think about that kind of solution? That sort of feels very binary in a certain sense. But talk to me a little bit about your experience or reflections on that as a way of addressing this context we're in.
Have experience, working with donors in the way that Emily and Heidi do, but this question of, perpetuity as a model versus a more limited life is a question that, at least from the legal perspective, we've been grappling with forever. I teach about some of these issues based on something from the 1500s in England, so this is a really long-standing question, and it came up when the foundation tool was created in 1969. Up until the floor debates on that legislation, it was intended to include a lifetime limit. So I think this is, always going to be a question, and I don't think there's a one size fits all, but I think donors, who have the, capacity to potentially engage in perpetual giving versus time limited giving really need to think about the power dynamics inherent in that question, and think about ways that as their assets are continued to be spent after their lifetimes, how are the decision makers going to be selected? And that goes back to that power sharing question that Heidi is talking about. We're seeing really interesting developments kind of on both sides of that question with some of these innovations, though. So an LLC model sort of is like a lifetime limited model, because if you don't pour those assets over at your death into a tax-exempt entity, they'll be treated as part of your estate, and that's typically not what very wealthy individuals want. But on the other side, the Patagonia exit strategy that Emily referenced is actually creating more perpetuity where otherwise you wouldn't have it. So I think donors are kind of experimenting with this question, and I think it's okay for them to reach different conclusions, as long as they're being really thoughtful about the kinds of impacts that decision has, kind of for generations that the donor certainly can't anticipate what their needs will be or what their preferences will be.
And Emily, I have a question to you in that, and then we're shortly going to turn to the mounting Q&A, really exciting questions we're getting from folks across the globe. I'm interested from a giving circle perspective, is there a sense of immediacy that sort of what you don't want to do is sort of turn into an intermediary in a traditional sense? Do you feel like the money moves more quickly in that context to address issues that people are individually passionate about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for us with giving circles, we tend to see it be pretty high velocity. Most giving circles have some kind of recurring cadence at which they grant money out. And most of them that we work with anyway tend to grant the entirety of the money that they've raised out at every cycle. So whether it's a quarterly cycle, which is the most popular, or an annual or a monthly, they tend to be pooling for that 3-month period, for example, and then granting all of that money away. Now, not all of them operate in that way. There are some, especially those that are larger and operate maybe on an annual cadence, where they'll hold some funds back, much like you might do with a donor advised fund, and then keep that funding for maybe a follow-on grant the next year or something along those lines. But I think it's one of the things that's exciting about this model is it's essentially kind of leveraging this donor advised fund infrastructure. I often talk about the infrastructure piece of this giving circle model as being like a community or a social DAF, but making it really active and engaged in getting those funds out into the community, which I think there's been this really wonderful trend toward giving while living, as they say. And but it's so interesting what Dana just brought up, how the Patagonian example is actually kind of the reverse of that. I hadn't put that together before, but it's fascinating to see donors playing with these different models.
Thank you so much. We're going to turn to the mounting Q&A now. And so I'm going to try to moderate that and see if I can't move us through as many questions as quickly as we can. Particularly want to go back, there's a question about small nonprofits. So given these changes and given some of the discussion we've been having here, what advice would you give for small nonprofits and how they think about their longevity and their ability to further their mission?
That's a great question. I think it's a particular challenge for, I think, a lot of the donation types of questions. It's the financial sustainability ends up being the critical key challenge. The thing that I would say is that I think if you're running a small nonprofit, it makes it especially important to be really aligned to your constituency, to really understand what the needs are and to lift up those stories. We've also lost some of our storytelling in the data collection that we're being asked to provide to philanthropy. So you're a little stuck in the middle, which is, I think, what really feels frustrating. But really bringing those stories to life, really doubling down on those relationships. I think those are the places where I think particularly when you're smaller, and it's probably worth defining small. Because I think nowadays, given the needs, given the requirements around the legal and regulatory frameworks, small today looks very different. I would say you're probably small at $1 million a year versus what small looked like when I started my career, which maybe was like you could make some real things happen with $100,000 annually.
The most, more than half of nonprofits are still under $50,000, a year. And that's been very stable, for many years. And so we micro small, not just small. And looking back at some of these questions here, somebody actually provoked a question about, how do we, think about innovation and moving to new while still recognizing and not turning our backs on the sort of importance of the infrastructure and the nonprofit environment that really does reflect the lion's share of most of the sector. And I think obviously, Emily, and the decision you made to stand up a nonprofit, it maybe reflects that. But so talk to us about how the relevance of that model still needs to be asserted and what can be shared with folks as we look at the new shiny object. Innovation is very enticing. How do we not reflect the things we're built on and that really we value and are important to the success of the sector?
Wow, that's a big one. One of the pieces that I was fortunate to write for the Johnson Center last year, gosh, maybe it was earlier this year. It was last year. Lose track of time. Was don't start a nonprofit, start a giving circle. So I don't know if I'm the best person to talk about this. I do think that there are lots of existing tools. To Dana's point earlier, I don't necessarily see people shutting down or stopping, use of these other tools, but I just think that people will expand the use of different tools for funding and for their impact. Like us, we've ended up with 3 different organizational structures essentially to make our work happen. And we also went through a transition, right? Like for our earlier stage, it was different than our middle stage and our later stage, and maybe it will change again. I don't know, but so I think I'm not sure exactly if going at this question with the intention of, maintaining existing infrastructure is how I would approach it, so much as just looking at the existing infrastructure as well as the new ones, seeing what resonates with you, what would be the most effective tool for the mission and purpose that you have, and going with that. So that would be my recommendation.
I agree. I think both this question and the last question, I think we also shouldn't lose the importance of collaboration. So I think one of the reasons why the more traditional vehicles are going to remain relevant is because we're just going to see a much more networked effort to engage in social good, whether that be kind of very horizontal networks of, like many small nonprofits can really, be advantaged by working together, or more of a vertical network, right? Where you've got different types of vehicles that all care about the same mission, figuring out ways to work together and collaborate. So I think that trend, which actually is a trend that you also see in the business world, is something that is really positive, and I'm starting to see develop in a very intentional way in the nonprofit sector that I think bodes well for the future.
Thank you. Now we have a question about regulation. And so Dana, this might come to you though. I think it's terrific to get different perspectives, sort of surround sound on an issue, because the question is very interesting. It's about regulation, but I think what it's really asking is about the through line. So if we think about different things that we value or that are relevant for these different approaches and ways of working, is there a through line? Is there sort of the first sort of 40 feet of cable, which is true about most of them? Or if we were going to prioritize what matters across the line, what would those items be? And so I think actually it's a regulatory question, but it's a broader question as well.
If I had to pick kind of two regulatory imperatives in the US context, and I think it's important to distinguish, our sector, which does do so much of what governments do in many other nations. I think you might have different values, but for me, I think I would choose accountability. There's this great concern, sometimes an overblown concern about greenwashing, is this really doing good? But then not at all overblown with the disconnect from beneficiaries and communities. So that question of accountability, are the efforts of the nonprofit sector really being directed toward the needs that it purports to support? And then the other that I would choose, and again, this is a very American approach, is pluralism. I think it's really important that there are a lot of different visions of the good and of the social change that's desirable. And I think it's important for regulation to take that as a first principle, that the goal is not to mold the sector into something that a majority of constituents would get behind, but instead to have a much more pluralistic vision.
Thank you. Heidi, I'd love your reflection on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think the regulatory questions are really interesting. I think that Dana pulled out the primary ones. And I think, for me, it's really about transparency, and my cat, clearly. It's really about transparency underneath that nests really neatly within accountability. I think when we look at intermediaries and regulations, one of the things that we hope we provide is the ability for smaller, untested ideas, is the ability to promote innovation, because you have a larger, more seasoned parent organization that is providing the appropriate checks and balances for new ideas. I also want to pick up on that international thread, though, which is that increasingly, I think those of us who are working in a global context are also seeing governments not wanting the influence of Western philanthropy, particularly around those kinds of large intractable questions, climate, human rights, where you have authoritarian governments. There is a real desire to keep the influence of foreign money, ideas, innovation out of those political contexts and conversations. And that is a reality that we are all dealing with. We won't solve some of these problems absent countries that have, some of the largest populations in the world. We can't say that we want to make real social change for people globally if we're going to abandon people globally. So I think for me, it's so much of it has come to the political, unfortunately, that we want to be able to show what Dana, I think, really eloquently articulated, which is the money going to the beneficiaries? Is the purpose being met? And are we enacting those kinds of pluralistic visions of good that people actually want to see on the ground?
And so the importance of accountability and transparency, which I think we've talked about, since the top of the hour. And I'm interested because to sort of assess and understand, or even, look at how the needle is potentially moving and assess the impact of that, you need to be able to access knowledge, right? And this might be slightly more on the researcherly, end of a question, but if we can't look at the traditional sources of data and information to understand what's happening, to see what people are doing, we're going to have a more difficult time uncovering it, talking about it, reflecting on it, making change, moderating and tweaking as we go along, and knowing what best to advocate for. So any thoughts or advice to researchers, people who engage in the field, of how our practices can catch up to sort of emerging trends?
Oh gosh. Sorry, I actually would turn on my light switch because it's motion activated.
I think
we won't take that as a response to the question.
Yeah, no, I think there's a couple of things in there that are particularly about, for us as intermediaries, as fiscal sponsors, it is a challenge. It's a challenge to drill down. Part of the value of what we provide is this consolidated reporting. Part of the challenge and part of the argument, if you happen to be working on the other side of the political spectrum from someone, is, well, that's a lack of transparency. But the fact is, this tool is used in a very pluralistic way. Organizations across the spectrum absolutely utilize intermediaries to engage and create thoughtful work. So some of it's technology, some of it's regulation, and frankly, at some level, you don't always want that regulatory eye on you, because legislation is a blunt instrument. And in trying to solve for one thing, you're often going to create a lot of downstream effects. I remember when Sarbanes-Oxley was passed, the downstream effects of that for nonprofit corporations that are still corporations. It was about corporate oversight. It was about bad behavior in for-profit corporations, but the downstream effects and how that created additional burdens for nonprofit organizations were huge.
And in the absence of regulation, as we sort of have to wind down, there's no barrier to somebody self-reporting. And so there certainly is, though it would, not to say it's an easy climb, but it could certainly be something that's worth the effort, is in the absence of regulation, or the effect that regulation would have, to do a move towards, self-reporting and sort of living and expressing those values as a sector by choice and not by mandate.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important to say that, researchers can too heavily rely on, the easy data, right? And there's a lot that you can glean from, mining Forms 990, but there's a lot you're going to miss. And, I think that being forced to engage in more qualitative research and, going to the source rather than using, data sets that are available from the government can add a lot of richness to our work.
Which I think
Ask us,
back.
please ask us. We're happy to share.
That's lovely. That's wonderful to know. And I think that goes back also to having the infrastructure and the resources to be able to take those extra steps, to have the time and space and support to be able to do that kind of investigation and analysis. But it's a much more expensive climb.
Yes.
Not to say it's not more worthwhile, but that implicates some other things about the sector wanting to examine itself, I think.
Well, I think there's also just a move toward trust-based philanthropy and, giving in this way that is going to be pushing us in that direction, probably has already, right beyond the regulatory considerations.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, what a brilliant and thought-provoking conversation. I'm just delighted to have the privilege to engage and ask questions and continue to learn more through the incredible conversation we've had here today. I can't thank you enough for your time, for your commitment to the sector, and for your willingness to be here today. So thank you, Bree, so much for everything. I want to remind everybody to sign up for emails and events on the johnsonCenter.org at the homepage. I wish everybody a wonderful rest of the day. Look for the survey. Please do fill it out and look within the next week or so for the slides from this presentation. I wish everybody, in the words of Heidi, a wonderful morning, afternoon, and evening. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take a good.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.